Welcome back. This is Mr. Wakefield looking at Section 7.1, Part 2 of Section 7.1. We already did the first part in a previous video, and we talked about how to figure out the GCF. Well, that's actually going to be part of a bigger thing now in these problems we're going to be looking at in the next few sections. What we're going to be looking at is we're going to be talking about factoring 4 terms, and then we're going to learn how to factor 3 terms, and then eventually 2 terms. Those are the 3 different types of polynomials that we're going to look at. But in this particular sheet right now, we're going to look at 4 terms. Okay, you can see I mentioned that right here. What do you do anytime they ask you to factor 4 terms? And before I go any further with that, just one additional thing I want to mention. If you're on a test question, you guys, for example, and they just say factor the GCF from the polynomial, then the GCF step is all that you have to do. You don't have to do any succeeding step after that, okay, just the GCF step. But moving forward now, whenever they give you any other directions that involve factoring, like if they say factor by grouping, factor this polynomial, something like that, any other type of factoring directions they give you besides when they use the words factor the GCF from the polynomial, they don't want you to just do the GCF step only. That is the first step, as you can see here, okay, but it's not the only step, all right? So any other types of factoring directions, they do want you to do the GCF step, and they want you to do it first, always. You can see it says here, always do this first when you factor any polynomial, okay? But the difference is that they want you to do more than that. Okay, after that. Usually there'll be one other big step that you do. Okay, that might have like little steps within it as well, but it's one other big step, one other big thing you got to do. There's a slight exception to that where there might be more than one other big thing you got to do, but you won't see that until 6.4. I'll go over that carefully, don't worry. But most of these problems that have other directions besides factoring out the GCF from the polynomial, like this one right here, they want you to do these 2 major steps. Do the GCF first, and then do, in the case of 4 terms, we're going to do this. When you have 3 terms or 2 terms, the second step will be different. But it doesn't matter how many terms you guys have, that first step will always be the GCF. It's just that the second step will be different depending on how many terms you have. If you have 4 terms, this is it. It's called factoring by grouping. We'll go over that here in a minute. Okay? So, here's the good news, though, at least as far as time. On all these problems on this sheet, the GCF is equal to 1. If you look at all of these problems, all 7 of them, the GCF is equal to 1 on all of these. You do not have to factor out the GCF when it's equal to 1 in the original problem. Okay, there is some other GCF stuff we got to do sometimes within the problem. We'll go over that in a minute. And there is an exception to that idea where you can just skip the GCF step if it's equal to 1, all right? Sometimes you got to factor it out. But if it's the original problem, you're doing the original problem and you're on the first step of the whole problem and you know you got to factor out the GCF from the entire polynomial, in that case, if it's equal to 1, you can skip this step. You can skip the step if it's equal to 1. If it's anything other than 1, if it's anything bigger than 1, if it's 2, if it's 2x squared, if it's 3x to the 4th, you got to factor it out. You cannot skip this step in that case, all right, if it's something other than 1, all right? Let's go ahead and jump into these problems. Like I said, you can skip that first step on all of these. The reason why I have that in the directions there at the top, even though it's not going to happen on any of these problems, is because sometime in the future it might still happen, okay, in some other problems where you have 4 terms, but just not in these, okay? So it's just a good thing to remember. So what is the second step here? It says here, do factor by grouping, and that involves these 3 steps here, okay? First step says group the first 2 terms like this. Please do not use parentheses because then it'll look like you're multiplying them, depending on how you write it. But even if it doesn't look like that, it still might kind of throw you off because we're not supposed to have parentheses yet on the step. So please use these little brackets underneath It helps you visualize the grouping that you have to do without using parentheses, okay? Believe me, I've seen students use parentheses and it ends up completely throwing them off, okay? Use these brackets underneath, and you don't even need to write this anyway, all right? This is just to help you visualize how you're supposed to group it, and that's why I wrote these little brackets here. Just don't use parentheses, okay? So what we're going to do is when we group the first two and last two, we're going to factor out the GCF from each group separately. Again, remember, this is different than factoring a GCF out of the whole thing. That's 4 terms. What we're doing is we're factoring the GCF from just these 2 terms only, and then these 2 terms only as well separately. All right, so it's a different GCF. What is the GCF of this? It's going to, if you just use the same techniques that we used in the last section, and you don't have to show your work when you do the GCF, by the way. Okay, all that work I did earlier, all right, I'm not requiring you to show the work when you find the GCF, okay? I just did that so that I can review that with you to make sure that you understand how I was getting the answer so that you could do it as well. But when you figure out the GCF, just to let you know, I'm not going to require that you show the work on actually finding it. Okay, but I do recommend that you show the work for your own sake if that helps ensure that you're getting the answer right. Okay, the GCF here, though, is going to be doing the same techniques we did in the first part of this section in the previous video. It's going to be 4a to the first. Notice there's no b in the GCF because the b is not in both terms here. Then I factor it out. There's going to be 2 terms inside of this bracket because there's 2 terms here. And then what does 4a get multiplied by? Well, it would be multiplied by 1a squared to get 4a to the third. Okay. And then it would be multiplied by -3 to get -12. A to the first and a to the first are the same, so we don't put a in there. But as I told you earlier, if you do not have a b in the GCF, but you have a b here, you got to put the entire b along with its exponent. You just need to drop it down. Okay, so I put b down there. Okay, then you do the same thing here with the second part. All right, so what's the GCF here? The coefficient will be 1, but then you're going to have no a in there because a is not in both terms. But then b to the first and b to the second, that means it's going to be b. All right, but the reason why I left some space here, though, you guys, is because I need to put either a plus or minus here. Sometimes it's going to be plus, and like I said a few minutes ago, sometimes you're going to include a negative with your GCF. All right, I'll teach you about when you have to do that, like I promised. But try to do it with positive first. So put a plus there. If it's going to be positive, you got to do a plus. You can't just leave it blank. All right, and then factor out positive b. What do you get? You would get a squared, because b times a squared is a squared b. And then since the coefficient's 1, the -3 is going to be here. 1 times -3 is -3. And then because this is b to the first, we need to have another b to the first, because 1 plus 1 would give you the b to the second. Okay? Now there's something very interesting that just happened here, which is key to this whole problem, and all 7 of these problems. And that is this. These 2 brackets are exactly the same. Exactly the same. Okay? If they are exactly the same, then that allows us to go to the next step. Okay? Before I show you the next step, though, I want to make a point here. Look at this side example that I wrote down here. See how I've got 4a times a variable and then plus b times the same variable there, which I highlighted in red? Okay, it's the same kind of thing going on in this problem. It just looks a little more complicated. We have 4a times a bracket plus b times the same bracket. Okay, so z is playing the same role that the bracket is. The z's are the same, just like the brackets are the same. And the z's are being multiplied by 4a and plus b, just like the brackets are being multiplied by 4a and plus b. And so my point is that we can, just like however we do this problem right here, you could do the real problem that we're doing right now in the same way. How would I do this problem normally? Well, I would factor out the z. Okay, And then what would this be if I factor out the z? Wouldn't it be 4a plus b? It would be, wouldn't it? Okay. And so in the same way, I know this is kind of unusual because it's a bracket, but if these two brackets are the same in a factor by grouping problem, you guys, and I want to make this very clear, you guys, this only works if the brackets are the same. You're not allowed to do what I'm about to do if the brackets are not the same. Okay? But if they are, just like the z's are the same, what you can do is, just like you did with the letter B right there, you can move the bracket to the front. Okay, z is in front, the bracket's in the front. And then just like we had 4a plus b in the bracket next to the z down here, you put 4a plus b into the bracket next to the bracket I put in front. And what that produces is it produces two brackets. After you do the GCF step, which we skipped here, but you have to at least try to do it. Okay, since the GCF was 1, we skipped it, but we have to at least try to see what the GCF is. Okay, after you do the GCF step, though, when you get to the second step, which is going to be the grouping method when you have 4 terms, it's on that second step, you guys, that you're trying to produce two brackets. You're trying to produce two brackets that are being multiplied together. So once you do that, you're done. There's one exception to that, which I said we'll see. It's a rare exception that we'll see in section 6.4. But other than that, you guys, when you get to these two brackets right here, you're done with your factoring problem. Okay? Unless it's one of those problems where it says, oh, you just have to factor out the GCF. Then you don't need to go this far. But otherwise, you need to at least try to produce those two brackets. Sometimes you won't be able to produce these two brackets, but you have to at least try to. And then if you are successful in producing the two brackets, then you know that you can stop, okay? With that one rare exception that I'll show you later. But usually, you can stop there when you're doing a factoring problem, okay? Let's go do this next one here. All right, and don't worry, when we get down to the end of factoring, you guys, we're going to kind of summarize all the different possible ways a problem could go because I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, okay, with these problems, a lot of different ways it could go. Completely understandable, but as we do more practice, we're going to get better and better at not only understanding it, but remembering what to do. Next one here. What is the GCF of the, and remember, we're skipping the first step where we try to figure out the GCF of the whole problem because we already know that the GCF is 1, and so we can skip that when the entire problem has a GCF of 1, as we said before. So we go to the factor by grouping step, step 2, and that means the big step 2 right here where we try to do these 3 steps. And what do we get here? If we factor out the Q, which is the GCF there, 1Q, what do you get? Don't you get R plus 3 right there? Again, just using the same GCF techniques that we learned in the first part of section 7.1. Okay, now in the second part here, the GCF is 1. Okay, however, remember I said that there's going to be times where you have to factor out the GCF. Okay, this is one of those times, sorry, let me say that again. There are times when you're going to have to factor out the GCF even when it's equal to 1. There are, okay? Not when the entire problem has a GCF of 1, but this is one of those times when you will, even when it's equal to 1. The reason why is because we need to produce two brackets that are the same like we saw over here. I can't produce a second bracket here to see if it's the same as this one unless I factor out my GCF, no matter what it is. So like I told you guys, sometimes it's going to be plus, and sometimes it's going to be minus. Let's try out the plus first because that usually works more often than not. But what happens if I factor out positive 1? Anytime you factor out positive 1, it doesn't change. It's still going to be negative r minus 3 because when you multiply by 1, it's the same thing. 1 times 8 is 8. 1 times 10 is 10. 1 times negative r is negative r, right? There's a problem here, though. The brackets aren't the same, you guys. So when that happens, then what you need to do is try to make this into a negative. Erase what you got inside the bracket there. Make this into a negative in front of the second GCF. This is one of those situations where you have to factor out a negative. Okay, remember I said back in the first video for section 7.1, if you have a situation where I tell you that you need to include a negative with the GCF, don't forget to do that. Okay, in that situation. Well, this is one of those situations when the plus doesn't work, you got to try the minus. I'm not saying it's always going to work, but you got to at least try it. Okay, so this is one of those situations where you're in the second GCF and the factor by grouping. Okay, you don't need to do it over here, don't worry. Okay, just factor out the GCF. But then when you get to this part, if the plus doesn't work, you guys try the minus. All right, and so I'm going to try the minus. Does it make the brackets the same? It sure does. It makes them exactly the same, r plus 3 and r plus 3. So if the plus doesn't work, that's one of those situations where you got to try the negative with the GCF, all right, and see if it works. We'll see in the next problem that sometimes the negative doesn't work either, and I'll tell you how to handle that when we get to that problem. Okay? All right, now, since the brackets are the same, though, just like in the last problem, you take the bracket that's the same and you move it to the front. You only write it once. Just like with the z right here, when I factored it out, I only wrote it once, even though it appeared twice up here. It's the same thing with the bracket. The bracket appears twice here, and now it appears only once down here, just like the z. Okay? And then what you do is, just like we did in the last problem where we had 4a plus b in the other bracket, in the same way here, we're going to do q minus 1 in the second bracket. Okay? Excuse me, I got to get some new lead in the pencil here. All right, there we go. Okay. So, moving on to problem C here. If I try to do the, again, we skip the GCF step where you try to factor out the GCF of the whole problem because it's just equal to 1. Okay. In the second part here, the second step where you try to group them, do the two groups, here's the problem though on this one. Both of these GCFs are equal to 1, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It still could work. The important thing is that the brackets end up being the same. Unfortunately though, and get ready to erase this. I'm just going to write it down. You don't have to write it down yet because I'm just going to erase it anyway, but I want to just show you why I'm going to erase it. If I factored out the 1 on both of these, I get two brackets that are completely different, don't I? Okay, so that's not going to work. Now, as I taught you, when you get to the second part here, if the positive GCF doesn't work, you have to do the minus 1. But if I do the minus 1, you guys, it's still not going to be the same bracket as this, is it? It's just going to change the signs of these terms, but you're still going to have the wrong numbers and everything. Okay, and so, okay, so since I tried the negative 1 also, that's still not going to work. That means we're definitely not going to produce the same two brackets, but that doesn't mean that we just give up, okay? As you see down here where it says note right here, it says that step 2, which is the step where you try to get the common bracket, if it says it does not result in a common binomial factor, that's the same thing as saying common bracket because the bracket is going to be a binomial, meaning it has two terms in it. Okay. In that case, we try to rearrange the terms in the original problem and try to do the steps again. Okay, so I'm going to take my eraser. All right. And I'm going to rearrange the terms. Now you might be wondering, how do I rearrange the terms? You just got to keep trying something or try different things until something works. If you've tried absolutely everything and nothing works, then this is one of those problems where you can't factor, where you can't produce the two brackets. That's not normally going to happen, don't worry. Okay, but it is possible sometime in the future. It won't happen on this sheet. All right. But I'm just letting you know that. But usually when you're doing a factor by grouping problem with the four terms, you will find an arrangement that works. You just got to keep trying. Here, let me give you a tip, though, that'll help you. Notice that 12 and 3 and 7 and 28, those two groups have a common theme to them. Let me show you what it is. 28 is 4 times bigger than 7, and 12 is 4 times bigger than 3. So there's a common thing going on there. And so that's the kind of thing I look for personally when I'm trying to find the right rearrangement. Okay, and so I'm going to put it that way. I'm going to put the 7 and 28 together, those terms, and I'm going to put the 12 and 3D together. Make sure that the same sign is still in front of each term when you rearrange your polynomial. We've talked about that before. Okay, since they were all positive, they're still all going to be positive in front of each term when you rearrange them. Okay, make sure that it's the correct sign, in other words, in front of each term. Let's try to do the factor by grouping again. The first one here, the GCF, is going to be 7C. 7C. And so if I factor that out, I get D plus 4. Then if I factor out the GCF out of the second part, which is I'm going to start out with plus 3. If that doesn't work, I'll do minus 3. But if I do that, I get 4 plus D. Now I want to talk about that right now. That was for plus 3. Okay, the brackets don't look exactly the same, right? But they actually are the same. It's okay to have your terms out of order, you guys, inside of the two brackets, as long as they are the same two terms, D and D, 4 and 4, and they both have the same sign. Positive D, positive 4, positive 4. As long as they're the same two terms with the same signs in front of each one, okay, then that counts, even though they're not in the same order. So you can say that these two things are the same, and therefore you can move on to the final step of the factor by grouping. That's okay. All right. So what would that be? And you might be wondering, well, wait a second. If there are two different orders here, how do I know which one of these two things I put in front since they look a little bit different? Because they are exactly the same, you guys, theoretically, it's your choice. You could put D plus 4 in front. You could put 4 plus D in front. It does not matter, I promise you, okay? Just don't put both of them in front. Remember, you're only supposed to put one bracket, just like we said with the Z here, all right? The two Z's just become one Z. So don't put both of the brackets in front, just one of these two, your choice, since it doesn't matter either way. And then as we talked about, we put the 7C plus 3 in the other bracket. Okay? So there you go. And we got our two brackets, so we're done. All right. Now, let's say that, and typically when I assign homework problems, you guys, it'll be odd-numbered problems. And the odd-numbered problems have the answers in the back of the book. And I encourage you to check your answers by looking in the back after you've done the problems. But let's say that you're looking in the back and the answer says this instead. Does that mean that you're wrong? Does that mean that your answer is wrong? No, it doesn't, okay? Because, again, D plus 4 and 4 plus D are the same thing. So these two answers are the same, okay? So your answer would still be right. What if it said this? What if it said 7C plus 3 times 4 plus D? That's also okay because it is the same thing as this answer, okay, which we already know is correct. We just mentioned that, except for we reverse the brackets. But when you're multiplying any two things, you guys, whether it's two numbers or in this case two brackets, all right, the order doesn't matter as long as it's the same two brackets. Okay, so since these two brackets are the same as these two and they're being multiplied, the order doesn't matter. Okay, I know that because you know how like 3 plus 7 and 7 plus 3 are the same answer? It's the same thing. When you're multiplying two things, you guys, whether they're two numbers or two brackets, if you reverse the two things that are being subtracted, it's still the same answer. So all three of these things are the same. Okay, and so all three of them would be an acceptable answer. So don't worry if you get one of these types of things here in the back of the book when you get something like this as your answer. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. Okay, you're still good. All right, so please go ahead and try these last 4 problems right here. You'll end up finding out in one of these 4 problems that you need to rearrange the terms. Okay, just go ahead and keep trying different rearrangements until you find one that gives you a common bracket. And then hit the play button when you're done. We'll take a look at those answers. Okay, number 1, let's take a look. Again, we skip the GCF step for the whole problem because it's equal to 1. But then when we group them, what GCFs do we get here? 10x squared and 3. That produces 2 brackets that are the same. Okay. And because the brackets because the brackets are the same, what do? We take that common bracket and we write it down just one time in the front. Okay. And then we say 10x squared plus 3 on the back. Okay? Number 2. Same idea here. We skip the GCF step for the whole problem, but we do the 2 individual GCFs for each group. We get what? We get 5AB and positive 2. Again, if positive 2 did not work, then you would try negative 2, but positive 2 did produce the same bracket as this one over here, so we're good. That's what we want when we're doing factoring by grouping, okay, is we want that same bracket. If we get the same bracket, we put it in the front, and then we do 5AB plus 2. You got to remember to put that in a bracket also. That's important. Even though it's not in a bracket up here, it needs to be in one down here. Okay? So that's number 2. Number 3. Again, skip the GCF step for the overall problem, but then we have GCFs of what? 7y, and then normally this would be plus 1, but that wouldn't have worked. However, minus 1 does give you the same bracket, so I did that one instead. Okay, since the brackets are exactly the same, I move the bracket to the front, x squared plus 3, and then 7y minus 1 goes into the other one. Okay. And finally, in number 4, that's the one where if I try to do the GCF on each part here, you can see I crossed it out already. I got 2, and I got xy. I even tried the negative with the xy, but the brackets weren't even close to being the same. So as you can see, I crossed that out. So again, since the brackets ended up not being the same, even when I tried the negative xy, I need to do a rearrangement. All right, because the goal when you do factor by grouping, and remember, factor by grouping is what you do after you've factored out, or after you've tried to factor out the GCF. It's what you do when you have 4 terms. And so that's our goal here, is to do factor by grouping because there's 4 terms, and the goal of factor by grouping is to produce 2 brackets that are the same. And so that's why we needed to, again, do something different here where we rearrange the terms. I rearranged them here. The reason why I picked this order, it doesn't mean you have to do it. There is more than one way to do this. There really is. Okay, what's important is that you end up with an order that works. There's more than one order that works, I promise you. Okay, so I picked this because 24 was 4 times bigger than 6, and 28 was 4 times bigger than 7. So I figured that there was a pattern there, like I showed you in problem C. But again, there's other patterns that work as well. Just keep trying. And so I did it this way. I got these 2 GCFs, but including a negative with the 7 there, it does produce 2 brackets that are the same. And so moving that bracket to the front and then doing 6xy squared minus 7, okay, I end up getting the 2 brackets that I need. Okay, and so once you get the 2 brackets there, in these factor by grouping problems, unless it's one of those 6.4 problems that I'll tell you about later, when you get to the 2 brackets, that is as far as a factoring problem goes. It doesn't mean that it's always going to go that far, but if it does go, if you do get to the 2 brackets here being multiplied together, unless it's the 6.4 exception, that's where you want to end up. Okay, so that concludes Section 7.1 with the second video. It is now completely done, Section 7.1. So let me know if you have any questions about factor by grouping. And as we move forward, we're going to learn in the next couple sections about how to do factoring for 3 terms, and then eventually in 6.4, factoring for just 2 terms. Okay, we're not going to be factoring 5 terms, and we're not going to be factoring a single term, just 4 terms, 3 terms, and 2 terms. All right, so we'll see the rest of that moving forward here. Have a good day, and we'll see you back for sections 6.2 and 6.3, which will actually be on the same video. Take care.